Chapter 2. The Hospital. The doctors went their rounds in the morning. Between 10 and 11 they made their appearance in our ward all together, with the chief doctor at their head, and an hour and a half before that our special ward doctor used to visit the ward. At that time our ward doctor was a friendly young man and a thoroughly good doctor. The convicts were very fond of him, and only found one fault in him, that he was too soft. He was in fact not very ready of speech and seemed ill at ease with us. He would almost blush and change the diet at the first request of the patient, and I believe he would even have prescribed the medicines to suit their fancy if they had asked him. But he was a splendid young man. It may be said that many doctors in Russia enjoy the love and respect of the peasants, and as far as I have observed, that is perfectly true. I know that my words will seem paradoxical when one considers the distrust of medicine and of foreign drugs universally felt by the common people in Russia. A peasant will, in fact, even in severe illness, go on for years consulting a wise woman, or taking his homemade remedies, which are by no means to be despised, rather than go to a doctor or into a hospital. There is one important element in this feeling which has nothing to do with medicine. That is, the general distrust felt by the peasants for everything which is stamped with the hallmark of government. Moreover, the people are frightened and prejudiced against hospitals by all sorts of horrible tales and gossip, often absurd, but sometimes not without a foundation of fact. But what they fear most is the German routine of the hospital, the presence of strangers about them all the time they are ill, the strict rules in regard to diet, the tales of the rigorous severity of the attendants and doctors, and of the cutting open and dissection of the dead, and so on. Besides, the people argue that they will be treated by the gentry, for doctors are, after all, gentlemen. But all these terrors disappear very quickly when they come into closer contact with the doctors, generally speaking, not without exceptions, of course, which I think is greatly to the credit of our doctors, who are, for the most part, young men. The majority of them know how to gain the respect and even the love of the people. Anyway, I am writing of what I have myself seen and experienced many times and in many places, and I have no reason to think that things are different in other places. Here and there, of course, there are doctors who take bribes, make a great profit out of their hospitals, and neglect their patients almost completely, till they forget all they have learnt. Such men are still to be found, but I am speaking of the majority, or rather of the tendency, the spirit which animates the medical profession in our day. Whatever one may say in defense of these renegades, these wolves in the fold, however one may ascribe their shortcomings, for instance, to the environment of which they too are the victims, they will always be greatly to blame, especially if they also show a lack of humanity. Humanity, kindness, brotherly sympathy are sometimes of more use to the patients than any medicines. It is high time we gave up apathetic complaints of being corrupted by our environment. It is true, no doubt, that it does destroy a great deal in us, but not everything, and often a crafty and knowing rogue, especially if he is an eloquent speaker or writer, will cover up not simply weakness, but often real baseness, justifying it by the influence of his environment. But again, I have wandered from my subject. I merely meant to say that the mistrust and hostility of the peasants are directed rather against medical administration than against the doctors themselves. When the peasant finds out what they are really like, he quickly loses many of his prejudices. The general arrangements of our hospitals are still in many respects out of harmony with the national spirit. Their routine is still antagonistic to the people's habits, and not calculated to win their full confidence and respect. So at least it seems to me from some of my personal experiences. Our ward doctor usually stopped before every patient, examined and questioned him gravely and with the greatest attention, and prescribed his medicine and his diet. Sometimes he noticed that there was nothing the matter with the patient, but as the convict had come for a rest from work, or to lie on a mattress instead of bare boards, and in a warm room instead of in the damp lockup, where huge masses of pale and wasted prisoners were kept awaiting their trial. Prisoners awaiting trial are almost always all over Russia pale and wasted, a sure sign that they are generally physically and spiritually worse off than convicted prisoners. Our ward doctor calmly entered them as suffering from febris cataralis, and sometimes let them stay even for a week. We all used to laugh over this febris cataralis. We knew very well that this was, by a tacit understanding between the doctor and the patient, accepted as the formula for malingering or handy shooting pains, which was the convict's translation of febris cataralis. Sometimes a patient abused the doctor's soft-heartedness and stayed on till he was forcibly turned out. Then you should have seen our ward doctor. He seemed shy. He seemed ashamed to say straight out to the patient that he must get well and make haste to ask for his discharge, though he had full right to discharge him by writing on his chart, sanat est, without any talk or cajoling. At first he gave him a hint. Afterwards he tried, as it were, to persuade him. "Isn't your time up? You are almost well, you know. The ward is crowded." And so on, till the patient himself began to feel ashamed, and at last asked for his discharge of his own accord. The chief doctor, though he was a humane and honest man, the convicts were very fond of him too, was far sterner and more determined than the ward doctor. He could even show a grim severity on occasion, and he was particularly respected among us for it. He made his appearance, followed by the whole staff, and also examined each patient separately, staying longer with those who were seriously ill, and he always managed to say a kind, encouraging word to them, often full of true feeling. Altogether he made a very good impression. Convicts who came in with a handy shooting pain he never rejected nor turned out. But if the patient were too persistent, he simply discharged him. "Well, brother, you've been here long enough, you've had a rest. You can go, you mustn't outstay your welcome." Those who persisted in remaining were either lazy convicts who shirked work, especially in the summer when the hours were long, or prisoners who were awaiting corporal punishment. I remember special severity, even cruelty, being used in one such case to induce the convict to take his discharge. He came with an eye affection. His eyes were red, and he complained of an acute shooting pain in them. He was treated with blisters, leeches, drops of some corrosive fluid, but the malady remained. The eyes were no better. Little by little the doctors guessed that it was a sham. There was a continual slight inflammation which grew neither worse nor better. It was always in the same condition. The case was suspicious. The convicts had long known that he was shamming and deceiving people, though he did not confess it himself. He was a young fellow, rather good-looking indeed, though he made an unpleasant impression on all of them. Reserved, suspicious, frowning, he talked to no one, had a menacing look, held aloof from everyone as though he were suspicious. I remember it even occurred to some people that he might do something violent. He had been a soldier, had been found out in thieving on a large scale, and was sentenced to 1,000 strokes in a convict battalion. To defer the moment of punishment, as I have mentioned before, convicts sometimes resorted to terrible expedients. By stabbing one of the officials or a fellow convict, they would get a new trial, and their punishment would be deferred for some 2 months, and their aim would be attained. It was nothing to them that the punishment, when it did come 2 months later, would be twice or 3 times as severe. All they cared about was deferring the awful moment, if only for a few days at any cost. So extreme is sometimes the prostration of spirit of these poor creatures. Some of the convicts whispered among themselves that we ought to be on our guard against this man. He might murder someone in the night. However, it was only talk. No special precautions were taken, even by those who slept next to him. It was seen, however, that he rubbed his eyes at night with plaster taken from the wall as well as with something else, that they might be red in the morning. At last the head doctor threatened him with a seton. In obstinate eye affections of long duration, when every medical expedient has been tried to preserve the sight, the doctors have recourse to a violent and painful remedy. They apply a seton to the patient as they would to a horse. But even then the poor fellow would not consent to recover. He was too obstinate, or perhaps too cowardly. A seton perhaps was not so bad as the punishment with sticks, but it was very painful too. The patient's skin, as much as one can grip in the hand, is pinched up behind the neck, and all of it is stabbed through with a knife, which produces a long and wide wound all over the back of the neck. Through this wound they thrust a linen tape, rather wide, a finger's breadth. Then every day at a fixed hour they pull this tape in the wound so that it is opened again, that it may be continually separating and not healing. Yet for several days the poor fellow obstinately endured this torture, which was accompanied with horrible suffering, and only at last consented to take his discharge. His eyes became perfectly well in a single day, and as soon as his neck was healed he went to the lock-up to receive next day the punishment of 1,000 strokes with sticks. Of course, the minute before punishment is awful, so awful that I am wrong in calling the terror of it cowardice and weakness of spirit. It must be awful when men are ready to endure twice or thrice the punishment, if only they can avoid facing it at once. I have mentioned, however, that there were some who asked for their discharge before their backs were quite healed after the first beating, in order to endure the remainder of their punishment and have their sentence over. And detention in the lock-up awaiting punishment was without doubt incomparably worse for all than life in prison. But apart from the difference in temperaments, years of being accustomed to blows and punishments play a great part in the fortitude and fearlessness of some. Men who have been frequently flogged seem to harden their hearts and their backs. At last they look upon the punishment skeptically, almost as a trifling inconvenience, and lose all fear of it. Speaking generally, this is true. One of our convicts in the special divisions, a Kalmuck, who had been christened Aleksander, or Alexandra as they used to call him in the prison, a queer fellow, sly, fearless, and at the same time very good-natured, told me how he got through his 4,000 sticks. He told me about it, laughing and joking, but swore in earnest that if he had not from childhood, his earliest, tenderest childhood, always been under the lash, so that his back had literally never been free from scars all the while he lived with his horde, he never could have endured the punishment. He seemed to bless his education under the lash. "I was beaten for everything, Alexander Petrovitch," he told me one evening, sitting on my bed before the candles were lighted. "For everything and nothing. Whatever happened, I was beaten for 15 years on end, as far back as I can remember, several times every day. Anyone beat me who liked, so that in the end I got quite used to it." How he came to be a soldier I don't know. I don't remember, though perhaps he told me. He was an inveterate runaway and tramp. I only remember his account of how horribly frightened he was when he was condemned to 4,000 sticks for killing his superior officer. I knew I should be severely punished, and that perhaps I shouldn't come out alive. And though I was used to the lash, 4,000 strokes is no joke. Besides, all the officers were furious with me. I knew for certain that I shouldn't get through it, that I couldn't stand it. I shouldn't come out alive. First I tried getting christened. I thought maybe they'd forgive me, and though the fellows told me it would be no use, I shouldn't be pardoned, I thought I'd try it. Anyway, they'd have more feeling for a Christian after all. Well, they christened me, and at the holy christening called me Aleksander, but the sticks remained. They did not take one off. I thought it was too bad. I said to myself, "Wait a bit, I'll be a match for you all." And would you believe it, Alexander Petrovich, I was a match for them. I was awfully good at pretending to be dead. That is, not being quite dead, but just on the point of expiring. I was brought out for punishment. I was led through the ranks for the first 1,000. It burnt me. I shouted. I was led back for the second 1,000. Well, thought I, my end is come. They've beaten all sense out of me. My legs were giving way. I fell to the ground. My eyes looked lifeless. My face was blue. I stopped breathing, and there was foam on my mouth. The doctor came up. "He'll die directly," said he. They carried me to the hospital, and I revived at once. Then they led me out twice again, and they were angry with me too, awfully angry. And I cheated them twice again. The second time I looked like dead after 1,000, and when it came to the 4th 1,000, every blow was like a knife in my heart. Every blow was as good as 3, it hurt so. They were savage with me. That niggardly last 1,000, damn it, was as bad as all the 3,000 together, and had I not died before the very end, there were only 200 left, they would have beaten me to death. But I took my own part. I deceived them again and shammed death. Again they were taken in, and how could they help being? The doctor believed I was dead. So they beat me for the last 200 with all the fury they could. They beat me so that it was worse than 2,000. But yet they didn't kill me, no fear. And why didn't they kill me? Why, just because I've grown up from childhood under the lash. That's why I am alive to this day. I have been beaten in my day," he added at the end of the story in a sort of mournful reverie, as though trying to recall and reckon how many times he had been beaten. "But no," he added after a minute's silence, "there is no counting the beatings I've had. How could I? They're beyond reckoning." He glanced at me and laughed, but so good-naturedly that I could not help smiling in response. "Do you know, Alexander Petrovich, that whenever I dream at night now, I always dream that I am being beaten? I never have any other dreams." He certainly often cried out at night, and so loudly that the other convicts waked him up at once by prodding him and saying, "What are you shouting for, you devil?" He was a short, sturdy fellow of 45, good-humoured and restless. He got on well with everyone, and though he was very fond of stealing, and often got a beating among us for that, after all, everyone stole, and everyone was beaten for it. I will add one other point. I was always amazed at the extraordinary good nature, the absence of vindictiveness, with which all these victims talked of how they had been beaten, and of the men who had beaten them. Often there was not the slightest trace of spite or hatred in their story, which gripped my heart at once and made it throb violently. Yet they would tell the story and laugh like children. M, for instance, described his punishment to me. He was not of the privileged class and received 500 strokes. I heard of this from the others and asked him myself whether it were true and how it happened. He answered with a certain brevity, as though with an inward pang. He seemed to avoid looking at me, and his face flushed. Half a minute later he did look at me. There was a gleam of hatred in his eyes, and his lips were quivering with indignation. I felt that he could never forget that page in his past. But almost all our convicts, I will not guarantee that there were no exceptions, took quite a different view of it. It cannot be, I sometimes thought, that they consider themselves guilty and deserving of punishment, especially when they have committed an offense not against one of their own class, but against someone in authority. The majority of them did not blame themselves at all. I have said already that I saw no signs of remorse even when the crime was against one of their class. As for crimes against officers in control of them, they did not count them at all. It sometimes seemed to me that for the latter class of crimes they had a peculiar, so to speak, practical, or rather matter-of-fact, point of view. They put it down to fate, to the inevitability of the act, and this was not done deliberately, but was an unconscious attitude, a kind of creed. Though the convict is almost always disposed to consider himself justified in any crime against officers, so much so that there is no question about it in his mind, yet in practice he recognizes that the authorities take a very different view of his crime, and that therefore he must be punished, and then they are quits. It is a mutual struggle. The criminal knows and never doubts that he will be acquitted by the verdict of his own class, who will never, he knows, entirely condemn him, and for the most part will fully acquit him, so long as his offense has not been against his equals, his brothers, his fellow peasants. His conscience is clear, and with that he is strong and not morally disturbed, and that is the chief thing. He feels, as it were, that he has something to rest upon, and so he feels no hatred, but takes what has happened to him as something inevitable, which has not begun with him and will not end with him, but will go on for long ages as part of a passive but stubborn and old-established feud. No soldier hates the individual Turk he is fighting with, yet the Turk stabs him, hacks at him, shoots him. Yet not all the stories I heard, however, showed the same coolness and indifference. They talked of Lieutenant Zherebiatnikov, for instance, with a certain shade of indignation, though even in this case the feeling was not very strong. I made the acquaintance of this Lieutenant Zherebiatnikov when I was first in hospital, from the convicts' stories about him, I mean. Afterwards I met him in the flesh when he was on duty at the prison. He was a tall man, about 30, big and fat, with red puffy cheeks, white teeth, and with a loud laugh like Nozdryov's. One could see from his face that he was a man who never thought about anything. He was particularly fond of flogging and punishing with sticks when it was his duty to superintend. I hasten to add that I looked upon Lieutenant Zherebiatnikov at the time as a monster, and that was how he was regarded by the convicts themselves. There were in the past, in that recent past, of course, of which the tradition is still fresh though it is hard to believe in it, other officers who were eager to do their duty conscientiously and zealously. But as a rule they did their work in all simplicity of heart without relishing it. Zherebiatnikov had something of the pleasure of an epicure in administering punishment. He was passionately fond of the art of punishing, and he loved it as an art. He enjoyed it, and like the worn-out aristocratic debauchees of the Roman Empire, he invented all sorts of subtleties, all sorts of unnatural tricks to excite and agreeably thrill his crass soul. The convict is led out for punishment. Zherebiatnikov is the officer in command. The mere sight of the long ranks of men drawn up with thick sticks in their hands inspires him. He walks round the ranks complacently and repeats emphatically that every man is to do his duty thoroughly, conscientiously, or else. But the soldiers don't need to be told what that "or else" means. Then the criminal is brought out, and if he knows nothing of Zherebiatnikov, if he has not heard all about him, this would be the sort of trick the lieutenant would play on him. One of hundreds, of course. The lieutenant was inexhaustible in inventing them. At the moment when the convict is stripped, and his hands are tied to the butt-ends of guns by which the sergeants afterwards drag him down the Green Street, it is the regular thing for him to beg in a plaintive, tearful voice, entreating the commanding officer to make his punishment easier, and not to increase it by unnecessary severity.
"Your Honor,"
cries the poor wretch,
"have mercy on me. Be a father to me. I'll pray for your honor all my life. Don't destroy me. Have pity on me."
That was just what Zherebiatnikov wanted. He would pause and would begin talking to the victim with a sentimental air. "But what am I to do, my friend?" he would begin. "It's not I am punishing you, it's the law."
"Your Honor, it's all in your hands. Have pity on me."
"Do you suppose I don't feel for you? Do you suppose it's a pleasure to me to see you beaten? I am a man too. Am I a man or not, do you suppose?"
"For sure, Your Honor. We all know you are our father. We are your children. Be a father to me,"
cries the convict, beginning to hope. "But judge for yourself, my friend. You've got sense. I know that as a fellow creature I ought to be merciful and indulgent even to a sinner like you."
"It's the holy truth you are speaking, Your Honor."
"Yes, to be merciful however sinful you may be. But it's not my doing, it's the law. Think of that. I have my duty to God and to my country. I shall be taking a great sin upon myself if I soften the law. Think of that."
"Your Honor."
"But there, so be it for your sake. I know I am doing wrong, but so be it. I will have mercy on you this time. I'll let you off easy. But what if I am doing you harm? If I have mercy on you this once and let you off easily, and you'll reckon on it being the same next time and commit a crime again, what then? It will be on my conscience."
"Your Honor, I'd not let friend or foe, as before the throne of the Heavenly Father."
All right. But do you swear to behave yourself for the future?"
"Strike me dead, may I never in the world to come."
"Don't swear, it's a sin. I'll believe your word. Do you give me your word?"
"Your Honor."
"Well, I tell you, I'll spare you simply for your orphan's tears. You are an orphan, aren't you?"
"Yes, Your Honor, alone in the world, neither father nor mother."
"Well, for the sake of your orphan's tears, but mind you, it's the last time. Take him," he adds in such a soft-hearted way that the convict does not know how to pray devoutly enough for such a benefactor. But the fearful procession begins. He is led along. The drum begins to boom. The sticks begin flying. "Give it him!" Zherebiatnikov bawls at the top of his voice. "Whack him! Flay him! Flay him! Scorch him! Lay it on! Lay it on! Hit him harder, the orphan! Harder, the rascal! Touch him up! Touch him up!" And the soldiers hit as hard as they can. The poor wretch begins to scream, and there are flashes before his eyes, while Zherebiatnikov runs after him along the line in peals of laughter, holding his sides and hardly able to stand, so that one felt sorry for the dear man at last. He is delighted and amused, and only from time to time there is a pause in his loud, hearty roars of laughter, and one hears again,
"Flay him! Flay him! Scorch him, the rascal! Scorch him, the orphan!"
Or he would invent another variation. The convict brought out to punishment begins to entreat him again. This time Zherebiatnikov does not grimace or play a part with him, but goes in for frankness. "I tell you what, my good fellow," he says, "I shall punish you properly, for you deserve it. But I tell you what I'll do for you. I won't tie you to the guns. You shall go alone, but in a new way. Run as fast as you can along the line. Every stick will hit you just the same, but it will sooner be over. What do you think? Would you like to try?" The convict listens with perplexity and mistrust and hesitates.
"Who knows?" he thinks to himself. "Maybe it will be easier. I'll run as hard as I can, and the pain will not last a quarter so long, and perhaps not all the sticks will hit me." "Very well, Your Honor, I agree."
"Well, I agree too, then.
Cut along. Mind now, look sharp,"
he shouts to the soldiers, though he knows beforehand that not one stick will miss the guilty back. The soldier knows very well what would be in store for him if he missed. The convict runs with all his might along the Green Street, but of course he doesn't get beyond the 15th soldier. The sticks fall upon his back like lightning, like the tattoo on a drum, and the poor wretch drops with a scream, as though he had been cut down or struck by a bullet.
"No, Your Honor, better the regular way,"
he says, getting up slowly from the ground, pale and frightened. And Zherebiatnikov, who knows the trick beforehand and how it ends, roars with laughter. But there is no describing all his diversions or all that was said about him. Stories of somewhat different tone and spirit were told of Lieutenant Smokolov, who was commanding officer of our prison before our major was appointed. Though the convicts talked somewhat unconcernedly and without special anger of Zherebiatnikov, yet they did not admire his exploits, they did not speak well of him, and were evidently disgusted by him. Indeed, they seemed to look down upon him with contempt. But Lieutenant Smokolov was remembered among us with enjoyment and delight. He had no particular liking for punishment. There was nothing of the Zherebiatnikov element in him. But he was by no means opposed to the lash. Yet the fact is that even his floggings were remembered among the convicts with love and satisfaction. So successful was the man in pleasing them. And how? How did he gain such popularity? It is true that the convicts, like all Russian people, perhaps, are ready to forget any tortures for the sake of a kind word. I mention it as a fact without qualifying it in one way or another. It was not difficult to please these people and to be popular among them. But Lieutenant Smokolov had won a peculiar popularity, so that even the way he used to administer punishment was remembered almost with tenderness.
"We had no need of a father,"
the convicts would say, and they would sigh, comparing their recollections of their old commanding officer Smokolov with the present major.
"He was a jolly good fellow."
He was a simple-hearted man, good-natured perhaps in his own way. But sometimes it happens that there is a man in authority who has not only good nature but a generous spirit, and yet everyone dislikes him, and sometimes they simply laugh at him. Smokolov knew how to behave so that they looked upon him as one of themselves, and this is a great art, or more accurately, an innate faculty, which even those who possess it never think about. Strange to say, some men of this sort are not good-natured at all, yet they sometimes gain great popularity. They don't despise, they don't scorn the people under their control. In that, I think, lies the explanation. There is no sign of the fine gentleman, no trace of class superiority about them. There is a peculiar whiff of the peasant inborn in them. And my word, what a keen scent the people have for it! What will they not give for it? They are ready to prefer the sternest man to the most merciful, if the former has a smack of their own homespun flavor. And what if the same man is really good-natured too, even though in a peculiar way of his own? Then he is beyond all price. Lieutenant Smokolov, as I have said already, sometimes punished severely, but he knew how to do it so that, far from being resented, his jokes on the occasion were, even in my day when it was all long past, remembered with enjoyment and laughter. He had not many such jokes, however. He was lacking in artistic fancy. In fact, he really had one solitary joke which was his mainstay for nearly a year. Perhaps its charm lay in its uniqueness. There was much simplicity in it. The guilty convict would be brought in to be flogged. Smokolov comes in with a laugh and a joke. He asks the culprit some irrelevant questions about his personal life in the prison, not with any sort of object, not to make up to him, but simply because he really wants to know. The birch rods are brought and a chair for Smokolov. He sits down and even lights his pipe. He had a very long pipe. The convict begins to entreat him. "No, brother, lie down, it's no use," says Smokolov. The convict sighs and lies down. "Come, my dear fellow, do you know this prayer by heart?" "To be sure, your honor, we are Christians. We learnt it from childhood." "Well then, repeat it." And the convict knows what to say and knows beforehand what will happen when he says it, because this trick has been repeated 30 times already with others. And Smokolov himself knows that the convict knows it, knows that even the soldiers who stand with lifted rods over the prostrate victim have heard of this joke long ago, and yet he repeats it again. It has taken such a hold on him once for all, perhaps from the vanity of an author, just because it is his own composition. The convict begins to repeat the prayer. The soldiers wait with their rods while Smokolov bends forward, raises his hand, leaves off smoking, and waits for the familiar word. After the first lines of the well-known prayer, the convict at last comes to the words, "Thy kingdom come." That's all he is waiting for. "Stay!" cries the inspired lieutenant, and instantly turning with an ecstatic gesture to a soldier, he cries, "Now give him some!" And he explodes with laughter. The soldiers standing round grin too. The man who thrashes grins. Even the man who was being thrashed almost grins, although at the word of command, "Now give him some," the rod whistles in the air to cut a minute later like a razor through his guilty flesh. And Smokolov is delighted just because he has had such a happy thought, and has himself found the word to rhyme with "come." And Smokolov goes away perfectly satisfied with himself, and, indeed, the man who has been flogged goes away almost satisfied with himself and with Smokolov. And half an hour later he will be telling the story in the prison of how the joke that had been repeated 30 times before had now been repeated for the 31st time. "He is a jolly good fellow. He loves a joke." There was even a flavor of maudlin sentimentality about some reminiscences of the good-natured lieutenant.
"Sometimes one would go by, brothers,"
a convict would tell us, his face all smiles at the recollection,
"and he'd be sitting in the window in his dressing-gown, drinking his tea and smoking his pipe. I'd take off my cap. 'Where are you off to, Aksionov?' he'd say. 'Why, to work, Mikhail Vassilitch. First thing I must go to the workroom.' He'd laugh to himself. He was a jolly good fellow. Jolly is the only word."
"We shall never see his like again," one of his listeners would add. Breaking in. The Kalmucks are a small Russian ethnic group descended from the Mongols. Most of them would have been Buddhist, which explains our Aleksander's cynical conversion to Orthodox Christianity in the hopes of reducing his sentence. The report he gives of the constant beatings he received from his earliest childhood does not portray the group in a very positive light. When Zherebiatnikov's laugh is compared to that of one Nozdryov, Dostoevsky is referring to a character from Gogol's novel Dead Souls. Nozdryov is a loud, obnoxious cheat whom you would expect to find in a drunken brawl. This chapter's portrayal of Lieutenant Zherebiatnikov himself might help to explain how it was that the later Dostoevsky could describe sadistic cruelty in his mature novels with such precision. I can only assume that the joke Lieutenant Smekhalov tells before administering corporal punishment is better in the original Russian. However, credit is due to our translator, Constance Garnett, for finding some rhyme in English for the purpose. There is some debate about whether Dostoevsky himself was ever administered corporal punishment. We know at least that he had one narrow escape. The major had accused him of shirking work and ordered him to be flogged, but the major's commanding officer countermanded the order because Dostoevsky had been ill and had been given permission to rest. My own view is that Dostoevsky never received the lash. The reason is that, given his sensitive nature, we could expect that he would have reacted to it the same way M did, with lingering, seething indignation. I don't think he would have been able to deliver the full, candid report on corporal punishment that we see here, which includes the convict's good-natured response to Smekhalov's methods. Clearly, however, he was intensely interested in the phenomenon, perhaps in part out of fear, which explains the wealth of information he accumulated about it. And we are not done with this topic yet. End of comments.